Hello, my name is Ralph Kiggell, and this paper is titled Ito Jakuchū and the Pleasure of Ink, Printing in Monochrome, and discusses the use of Sumi ink in the monochromatic prints of Itō Jakuchū, an artist from Kyoto who was active in the mid-Edo period. So fashionable and sought after have the various paintings and prints of Ito Jakuchu become that in 2006, Christie's New York sold one of his works for a world record for an ink hand scroll at that time of $441,600, over 5 times its low estimate of $80,000. The title of this hand scroll, Sui Bokuyu, translates as The Pleasure of Ink and dates to 1764. Sui Boku is the liquid form of Sumi, and Yu means to roam about in a pleasurable way, and refers to Jakuchu's enjoyment of the ink washes and ranges of black in the depictions here of plants, flowers, and birds, which he painted with a brush. Because the hand scroll remains in a private collection, there is no high-resolution reproduction available of it, but here is a set of ink paintings by Jakuchu mounted on a folding screen, which gives an idea of the painted birds in the Sui Bokuyu. Birds, especially chickens and roosters, were a favourite subject for Jakuchu, and the paintings here show his sense of design and the swooping lines of their feathers that he masterfully depicts with ink and brush. What is the considerable and ever-growing attraction for the work of Jakuchu? A simple answer is that his work stands out on the international art and auction scene for its recognizability, its individuality, and its modern, sometimes abstract appearance. Indeed, the very qualities of his unusual output that set him apart now account for much of his appeal. Following a growth of interest in Jakuchu from 1970, after the publication of art historian Nobuo Tsuji's book Lineage of Eccentrics, which grouped him alongside 7 other Edo artists as eccentric, Jakuchu has more recently been termed an otaku, a different kind of eccentric and a popular term among manga and anime lovers. This voguish term for a geeky outsider has drawn huge attention to Jakuchu from the global art scene, the same scene which admires, for example, the celebrity pop artist Takashi Murakami, born in 1962, himself a self-described otaku and a fan of Jakuchu. In a collaboration with Nobuo Tsuji and the Boston Museum of Arts, Murakami published a book in 2018 titled Takashi Murakami Lineage of Eccentrics, which now included himself in that lineage. In monochrome prints such as the silkscreen Flowers Black and the lithograph Black and White, Murakami may be as much inspired by Jakuchu's outsider whimsy as by the flat designs that Jakuchu's work is noted for, many of them using only ink, black and grey areas, separated by white lines and dotted with incised white calligraphic marks. Jakuchu's striking use of bold shapes and flat graphic design also corresponds somewhat to the postmodern art movement that Murakami invented in 2000, which he calls superflat. Murakami says that superflat is the typical 2-dimensional way of depicting scenes in traditional and contemporary Japanese art, and differs to the 3-dimensional perspective-based art that is more typical of Western art. He says, from as early as the era of Azuchi Momoyama through to the early Edo period, some artists qualified as eccentric emerged in the expressionist Japanese painting wave. Their ways of expression were characterized by pictorial compositions that were both eccentric and fantastical. From their pictures, one can feel a very typically Japanese engagement with the visual sense that wants resolutely to remain plein air, denying perspective. In their arrangement of subjects laid out on a flat plane, Jakuchu's designs do indeed largely deny perspective in a Western sense, but they also appeal for their unusual depictions of animals, birds, flowers, and insects, and fearless use of colour. And also, if we look at his monochrome prints and ink paintings, such as the printed plants and insects in this example here from the album Genpo Yoka, they also show extraordinary virtuosity in design and in their mastery of shape and line empowered by the properties of Sumi. The Christie's Sui Bokuyu, dating from the last few years of his life, is a long, unique monochrome ink painting, but the front and back sections are printed with Sumi from woodblocks. The frontispiece characters are by a Zen monk and friend of Jakuchu, Musen Jozen. According to Christie's, the 3-page colophon at the scroll's end is titled Genpo Yoka, Elegant Flowers of the Kunlun Mountains, and is by Jakuchu's great friend and mentor, Daiten Kenjo, a poet and a Zen monk. Jakuchu based several of his works around poems and texts by Daiten. What is interesting about these printed sections that were added to the painted scroll is that they are not conventional woodblock prints, but ink dab prints known as takuhanga. Although several other artists at the time also made dab prints, Jakuchu employed the technique with great verve and dexterity in hand scrolls and bound albums of prints, such as these, also from the album Genpo Yoka. The technique allowed him to create designs with a largely black background and with the luminous white marks as the negative. Why might Jakuchu have chosen this technique over the more commonly used mokuhanga? Taku means tamping or dabbing, and hanga means print. This printing method is also known as ishizuri, which means stone printing. It is the Japanese term for one of the oldest forms of print reproduction, which would have spread to Japan alongside woodblock printing, ink, and paper making from China. Known as taban in China, it began originally as a way to copy inscriptions or images carved into stone or clay by dabbing with cloth dabbers loaded with black ink. In a blog in 2014, Susan Catcher from the Victoria and Albert Museum, London, described how she learned to dab a print in Nanjing. First, a paidza, or dabber, was constructed from soft old cotton fabric, cotton wool, and enclosed in a plastic bag, all tied together to form a hard ball shape with a tail. Then, two, this was wrapped in a further layer of cotton. 3, a damp sheet of schwan paper was laid wet on the surface and tamped into position with a coir brush, pushing the paper into the valleys below, in this case a wood carving. Here the paper is left to dry in position. Then 4, the paidza is loaded with ink by dabbing against another dabber rather than directly loading from the ink slab. The paper needs to be strong-fibred and elastic enough to withstand this process. Slightly thinner papers would be mounted on thicker backing after the image had been taken. In most stone rubbings, because the original words and images were carved onto an otherwise smooth surface, usually a stone stela, the dabbed impressions tended to have black backgrounds surrounding white characters and lines. The effect would create a different aesthetic, like a photo negative, to the usual appearance of black characters and lines on a white background, as would be the case with calligraphy and ink painting. Also, the resulting image would not be a reversed mirror image, as with a print, and the characters as originally carved could be read correctly. This dabbing method became a useful way of making copies of famous inscriptions and images, giving them an otherwise far wider distribution. In China there was, and still is today, a great variety of ways to dab a print, and various forms may be seen in impressions taken from stone, wood, plaster and clay. Similarly, in Japan, the technique is used not only to copy stone inscriptions, but also woodcuts, carved three-dimensional objects, and even to record unusual or striking fish before they're eaten. Dab printing allows for great control of the release of ink onto the paper in soft greys gradations and by careful and repeated inking to attain exceptionally velvety blacks. The historian of Chinese print, David Barker, writes, "Dab prints considered to be the best examples of the art form were those showing both a heavily inked surface and those so finely printed as to be described as being fragile and transparent, like the wings of a cicada." Here are the range of tools and brushes available in China for dabbing, which may be similar to the materials that were used when making Jakuchu's prints. Alongside his deep interest in things Chinese, poetry, Taoism, Zen, and ink painting, Jakuchu would have undoubtedly found this technique somewhat exotic and archaic, appealing to his inquisitive side and his liking for white designs on a black background. In calligraphy, ink painting, and woodblock printing, black Sumi was the foremost graphic material for Japanese artists to execute a design. How the ink was ground and diluted on the inkstone, how much the brush was laden with ink, and how much pressure was applied by the artist to the brush when painting, all determined the way the ink spread across the paper. For woodblock prints, the use of Sumi was controlled in a different way, with any nuances coming from the static carved line and the varying pressures applied by the baron to the paper. In both painting and printmaking, Sumi could be used in thicker solutions to create deeper blacks, or diluted with water to provide a range of tones and gradations. Other artists at the time were aware of and may have used the ink dabbing method to produce monochrome work from woodblocks. Here is a takuhanga by Katsushika Hokusai of two characters from the Chinese classic The Water Margin. The print deliberately mimics stone rubbing in its composition and use of monochrome, although printed from woodblocks. And here are three other prints presented in long scroll format. The first is a real stone rubbing, which is taken from a Ming Dynasty stela, while the other two are by Okumura Masanobu. Jakuchu would not have cut or printed his own prints, but would have overseen the team of block carvers and printers who produced them. We can surmise that this method intrigued him because it could yield intense blacks. Although some of his ishizuri prints, such as these prints here of plants and flowers in the album Souken Sekisatsu, have a softer, more grainy look, we know that he often sought the densest blacks for his designs. For example, in several gorgeously coloured deluxe woodblock prints, a cutout stenciling method known as kappazuri was employed to hand dab in the rich black backgrounds. For the prints in the series Kachozu, pictures of flowers and birds from 1771, the black backgrounds were stenciled in deliberately dark. The kappazuri technique was adapted from stenciling methods used for printing textile designs. It was popular in the Osaka and Kyoto area where Jakuchu was from. A little like pochoir or screen print, the design was cut from a thick stencil. In Japan, this was made from layered and glued sheets of minogami paper, strengthened with persimmon tannin. The stencil would be laid exactly in position over a design on fabric or paper. Then colour would be dabbed through the cutout areas directly onto the surface below using a soft round brush loaded with dye or pigment, or in the case of Jakuchu's prints, with sumi. It's possible that stencils may have aided the dabbing process in some of his complex takuhanga, such as his masterpiece Jokyoshu. Aside from his black and white print series bound in albums, one of Jakuchu's most famous printed scrolls is the Jokyoshu, Impromptu Pleasures Afloat from 1767. It's a monochromatic record of a journey he made with his friend Daiten down the Yodo River from the Fushimi district in Kyoto to Osaka. The Yodo River, also called the Seta River or the Uji River, depending at which point it is along its route, begins at Lake Biwa in Shiga Prefecture, then flows southwest past Kyoto before being joined by smaller rivers north and south of Nara. It then flows through Osaka and out into Osaka Bay. It's about 75 kilometers long and from Kyoto to Osaka about 60 kilometers. In the 19th century, a trip by steamboat between Osaka and Fushimi took about 12 hours, apparently. In the colophon at the end of the scroll, Daiten describes how the two friends made the journey as they boated along the river. Jakuchu sketched with ink and brush as Daiten composed short poems in the Kanbun Chinese style. One poem reads, for example, "Mountains coloured, high and low, pale mist far off, people's dwellings here and there, kitchen smoke, nearby." The sketches were modified and painted as a long frieze, pasted onto several blocks, and then carved with Daiten's poems and notes on landmarks, cut into the blocks at each point along the journey. Remarkably, 5 of the original woodblocks still exist today. They show how the image and calligraphy on the block were carved right reading for the ishizuri rubbing. Because the recorded journey took from morning to night, the light changes accordingly, albeit in tones of black as the day progresses. Once printed, the scenes were then mounted in sequence as scrolls measuring nearly 12 meters in total length. As the scroll is unrolled poem by poem from right to left, the scenes unfold on both banks of the river, as if the viewer is taking the journey too. Here is the original woodblock of the final section of the hand scroll as they reach Osaka. By comparing the block with the print, you can see how fine and laborious the takuhanga process must have been, using dabbers of different sizes to work on the different sections, and perhaps aided by stencils. The white lines provide a useful gap between the deep black areas and the greyer areas, becoming an intrinsic part of the dynamism of the design. The dabbers are also used to create fine gradations of tone in the grey areas too. More accustomed to seeing ink painting and prints in black on white paper, or woodblock prints in colour, such as this one by Hiroshige, also of the Yodo River, the viewers who first beheld this scroll, and those who see it today, are startled and charmed by the strangeness of what is revealed. Inverted scenes of black skies and grey water separated by a white line, with temples, boats and people depicted in gestural white marks. These white areas beautifully match the brushstrokes of Jakuchu's original design, often appearing almost abstract. In masterpieces such as Jokyoshu, the unusual graphic design executed with a consummate knowledge of woodblock and Sumi gives us an insight into Jakuchu's individualism, his restless curiosity, and an understanding of his powerful contemporary appeal. Thank you.